ボールデブ球を返せボールデブボールデブ
Hello everyone, Skippy here, and welcome to One Piece episode 905, directed by newcomer episode director Tasuku Shimaya from Takahiro Imamura's board, and supervised by Masahiro Shimanuki. This episode is going to cover one of the biggest turning points for Act 1 of Wano, with Luffy's furious Red Hawk clash on Hold'em, which makes me worried about how this important episode is going to turn out considering the staff. Shimaya only has one episode to his name so far, directing Ayakomaki's board on episode 900, and therefore hasn't really been able to make a name for himself, so it's strange that he's been given such a big episode like this. Couple that together with what seems to be yet another small page count, and you can see just why I'm a bit worried about the quality of 905. It gives me the impression that this episode is once again going to be a rushed one, and I'm not saying that the staff on board can't deliver a satisfying episode, as Shimaya's direction was solid enough in 900, and there looks to be some good animators supporting Shimanuki at the very least, but when there's already so much that's stacked against it, I want to think realistically and not get my hopes up too high. So can episode 905 manage to surprise me and bring us back on track with this arc, or was I right to be skeptical about it this whole time? Well, let's get fired up to find out. Adaptation-wise, this episode covers the last 11 pages of chapter 917, and it's definitely an episode of two halves, because while the first half is wasting its time covering stuff that we saw last week and slogging through the new material, the second half actually adapts some of the events in the original chapter far better than Oda himself, in my opinion. Because rather than just having Okiku be some damsel that gets saved by the dog and brought to Zoro, we actually see Okiku joining Zoro and fighting Speed's men in the extended sequence of them trying to secure the wagon of food, with Luffy's rescue of Tama being a lot better as well, because instead of Luffy just slowly falling with Tama before he decides to attack Hold'em who's just standing there, Luffy actually moves around Bakata Town instead, with Hold'em pursuing him as well. Now these are obviously pretty substantial changes to the source material for sure, but they really make this whole event feel less rushed than it did in the manga, by having Kiku do stuff instead of just making her a damsel in distress, and having Hold'em actually be tons more competent rather than just standing on the top of his roof and waiting for Luffy to maybe try and attack him. It feels more like an actual challenge rather than just a simple one and done deal, and for that I applaud it. Sure, the first half is definitely not nearly as good in terms of adaptation by comparison, but I feel like very few Wano episodes have been able to impress me like this by ignoring a lot of what Oda did and instead choosing to do their own thing while still adhering to the main story beats. And for me, that's enough to be pleased with the adaptation in this episode. Now, while I do think that the board for this episode had a lot of really cool shots, I have to say that Imamura's board was pretty damn inconsistent in regards to its overall quality. While there's some really cool reflection shots, compositions that depict a pretty great sense of scale, and some fun use of visual distortion, the rest of Imamura's board ends up being rather unremarkable. While I feel like Shimaya was able to do the best he could with Imamura's board in regards to atmosphere, with the direction in the scene of Luffy's Red Hawk being quite powerful and made even better by a new Wano remix of original soundtrack, Imamura's board ends up being quite boring to look at sometimes and almost confused on the whole, with several cuts to random things and holding on the same handful of shots being ever so prevalent throughout the entire episode. You can see that Nagamine did his very best to clean up Imamura's efforts here, and I wouldn't be surprised really if a lot of the more interesting shots this episode were actually his doing, but the board feels quite a bit lazy in regards to actually making you interested in what you're looking at. I don't know if I necessarily blame Imamura here since the content itself is a bit limiting, but when there's shots here and there that actually get me thinking, oh, that looks nice, it's a tad bit disappointing that the rest of the board is kinda dull on the whole. As expected, this episode is very rushed, and the key animators list absolutely reflects that, with other supervisors like Hisata and Kitazaki being at the very top of the list, and Shimanuki himself actually not doing any animation of his own, instead focusing on his bold yet derpy corrections that leave Ichikawa and Matsuda correcting a good majority of it. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't any Sakuga to be had at all though, as Chu Young-se did manage to basically animate all of Zoro no Kiku's rush attack, and despite him even admitting that the schedule for the episode was tight, so he only did about 36 cuts in total, it's packed with enough smooth movement, smears, and subtle character acting. However, it's actually a surprise appearance from the animator whose levels of fanboyism would make Bartolomeo blush, with Takashi Kojima animating Luffy's Red Hawk on Hold'em. With insane art and effortless impact that's bundled together with the craziest brushstroke-like impact frames and modern fire effects, Kojima made sure that this moment was given the love and care that it truly deserved, and I couldn't be more happy with the results, with this probably standing as Kojima's best cut on the entire One Piece franchise, beating out his previous Red Hawk in the One Piece 3D2Y TV special. So while the episode as a whole is very inconsistent in terms of animation and art, it at the very least manages to bring forth a few cool little goodies that make me like this episode a lot more than last week's. While the episode itself suffers from a small page count and being under a pretty tight schedule, it manages to house some cool little interesting details in the adaptation and animation departments to make an inconsistent but not totally irredeemable episode, because there's several competent bits inside it that make me appreciate it a lot more than I would otherwise. My main question going forward really is if we can use these nuggets of quality here as a rebound leading into next week's episode, so we can get out of these last few weeks of very polarizing episodes. From the looks of things, it looks like Shigefume Shingaki is supervising, and the animation that's shown off in the preview looks pretty damn good when compared to what we've gotten in the past few next episode previews, so let's cross our fingers that the rest of the episode will indeed impress, since it looks to be covering a pretty good amount of pages. Anyways guys, that's it for now. I'm Skippy, and I'd be more than fine if I never had to hear Hold'em's laugh ever again.